And what you see around the country is not only are the candidates in the pockets of the paymasters, mostly from the corporate world, but they've gotten the people to vote against their own interests because the choices are so narrow between the Democratic and Republican parties that people end up, for example, if they can't stand Hillary Clinton, they vote for Trump, often in a very impulsive manner. And the worst example of that manufacturing consent that is hardly ever mentioned is access to the courts. They've actually persuaded a majority of people that there are too many frivolous suits and wrongfully injured people get too much money, when the facts are that less than 2% of wrongful injury ever get into the court to begin with, and that we're using the courts at a lower level in terms of civil lawsuits than was the case per capita in 1840. And so part of the manufacturing consent is, I guess, turning people against their own interests by throwing them up against the wall and having a mass media system that does not demonstrate what's going on in the country, in effect entertains and deceives. So how do you weave all that together in terms of a controlling system by the few over the many?
Well, there's an interesting image that's been proposed by some of the analysts and investigators who've done the most significant study of this paradox, as it's sometimes called, that people who are being undermined by political decisions are voting in favor of the candidates who are undermining them. Arlie Hochschild is one of those who's studied this in some depth. And
Strangers in Our Own Land. That's right. Her book.
It's very
And what's going on in Appalachia now.
Yeah,
yes.
Same thing. And the image that comes out, which the people themselves accept, is an image of people standing in a line. We're standing in a line. Behind us are our parents and our grandparents who worked hard and tried to fulfill the American dream. They had traditional families. They did the right thing. They were religious, and they got ahead. So they were moving along ahead in line. That's the American dream. All of a sudden, the line has stalled. We're standing in line, and it's stalled, or maybe even declined. Up ahead of us, there are people who are flying into the stratosphere, unbelievable wealth. But that doesn't bother us, because the propaganda system, which we internalize, tells us, okay, that's the American dream. They're working hard and getting ahead, mostly a joke, but that's the image. What worries them is the people behind them. And now we get the scapegoating aspect of the propaganda system. Ronald Reagan and his fairy tales about welfare mothers, by implication black women, rich women driving in limousines to the welfare office to pick up your hard-earned contributions into Social Security or whatever. That story. So the people behind us, according to the imagery, are worthless, they don't work hard, they're the wrong color, and so on and so forth. And what does the federal government do? The role of the federal government is to help those worthless people behind us get ahead of us with food stamps, with affirmative action, with welfare programs. So that's the role of the federal government. So therefore we should hate the government, not hate the concentrated wealth, which is corporate power, which is determining these policies. We don't see them. They're not part of the system. We see the federal government helping the worthless people behind us get ahead of us while we are stuck in the line. That's the imagery. And that's a pretty effective way of controlling people. And I suspect we're going to see more of that in the near future. Trump's promises, I'm going to bring jobs back, we're going to have a steel industry, of course they're not going to be realized. And what happens when they're not realized? We should remember that quite a few of the working class Trump voters voted for Obama in 2008. They believed, or at least put faith in, his promises of hope and change. Well, they pretty soon found out there was no hope and no change, so they were disillusioned, angry, ended up with their voting for their class enemy. who was shafting them at every possible moment. Well, what happens when these people realize that the promises, once again, were a delusion? At that point, the government, the ruling powers, private and state, are going to be forced to turn to more extreme scapegoating to direct the anger and disillusionment somewhere else, not to us, but somewhere else. Who's the someone else? Well, there's a long history of this, the most vulnerable parts of the population, or even of the vulnerable foreigners. And that could turn out to be pretty ugly. I mean, this is the moment to act constructively to try to prevent all of this. And there are ways of doing it. Again, the Sanders phenomenon was pretty remarkable. As I say, it broke from over a century of political tradition. And in fact, thanks to Fox News, we know their polls they ran that the most popular political figure in the country by a huge margin is Bernie Sanders. All of this indicates opportunities that are available to turn the tide if those opportunities are taken. You have to understand what's happening and then act,
And one of the ways consent is manufactured is to divide and rule so that people turn against each other, red state, blue state, left, right, conservative, liberal, and don't focus on the oligarchies and the plutocracies who are basically focusing people's attention on where they disagree with each other, like reproductive rights, school prayer, gun control, and not where there's a huge left-right consensus on many of the economic issues, the civil liberties issues, the cracking down on corporate crime, the opposition to crony capitalism, what we call corporate welfare, even criminal justice reform. So this divide and rule, I saw how this worked, Professor Chomsky, once when I read that Senator James Inhofe, Republican of Oklahoma, who thinks climate change is a hoax, and now has enormous influence in the Senate and over the EPA on climate change policy. He was once asked, how do you win these elections, Senator Inhofe in Oklahoma? And he smiled and he said, simple. It's God, gays, and guns. And that sort of sums up that divide and rule situation, which distracts people away from, let's face it, the few who are oppressing them economically and all other serious ways that impair a decent livelihood, fulfilling their human potential, and passing on something better to their children and grandchildren.